And then I'm going to highlight me, I think, spotlight me, so you can see what's going on. So we're tying patterns today. I'm going to tie 3 of basically it's the same pattern. It uses what's called a swimming nymph hook. It's a Mustad 400 something or another. And that's what it looks like. It's got a double bend to it. And the idea is that the fly will undulate as you retrieve it. That's the theory. I had a batch of these and I haven't used them for a while, so I figured, well, why not? Now the patterns came out of Taft Bryce's book called Tying and Fishing the Nymph. Of course, that's going to be reversed. And it's in a section on mayflies. And the section on mayflies, Taft talks about this being Japanese mayfly nymphs. A fellow by the name of Tashiro. The tyer is Masao Sakaguchi out of Yokohama. And it notes at the end of that section that mayflies in Japan are similar to European and American, but they're different species, which probably explains why the hook size that he's talking about is a little larger than we would for mayflies. And I'm tying these on a size 10. I do have some size 14s, but I'm tying these on a size 10 so you can see it better. So the first one is the ephemerella, whatever I posted. And I'm going to tie this one in a version where the hook, when it's fished, will float point up. So I'm going to make it float point up, I've got some 0.020 lead wire, or lead free wire, actually, and I'm going to cut off a little piece of it. I'm just going to see, that's maybe a little long. I'm going to basically tie it on the shank just before the bend of the hook. The thread is brown 8/0, and I am going to start just below that first bend. And I've got it in the vise so that the shank in front of the bend is horizontal. I'm going to wrap the thread down there, and that's mostly in order to provide a base for the lead wire to adhere to when I put it on. So I'm going to take this little piece of lead wire, bring the thread back up, and I'm going to try and tie that on top of the shank as best I can. The whole idea behind this is to cause this part of the fly to flip, this weight on this part of the fly is to cause it to flip inverted when you retrieve it. So I'm going to cinch that down pretty good, right down and around the bend a hair. Just make sure it's on there good and solid and it's not going to twist around the shank. And I'm going to bring my thread back to just a little bit behind the point, about where the barb used to be. And I'm going to put the tail in, which now in the notes I sent to you, I first tied the first pattern with first one, and I'll give you, here's what it looks like. That's the guy there. I first used a white peacock curl because I couldn't find my natural, but I did find the natural. So it says to use the natural. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to take some fibers off here, the short ones. I don't need really long ones for this. And I'm going to take 3 or 4 off of the stem. About that 3. And I'm going to lay that down. I'm going to put them about gap width behind the bend of the hook. So it's going to try and even up those tips a little bit. Now this natural ostrich herl is fairly fine. And I'm going to wrap that forward just over top of the lead, just to provide a little bulk for the body, and get the butt ends out of the way. Trim them off. Now for rib, I've got some really fine gold tinsel that I have on a spool, and I'm going to tie that in right where the lead starts by the tip. Stuff keeps unwinding on me. This darn Thiamco thread, when you let it hang, with the spool weight, it tends to spin itself the wrong way. So now I'm going to wrap that down, and I'm going to try and get it at the end of the wrapping down the shank of the hook. I'm going to try and get it on the far side of the hook, on the side and maybe almost at the bottom. This is going to be the rib for the body. Get that out of the way. Now, I've had this Western angling art dubbing hanging around for a long time, and I figure it was time for me to use it up. So when they called for dirty yellow dubbing, lo and behold, I have some dubbing, yellow dubbing, dirty yellow dubbing in that stuff, so I'm going to use it up. Now, you don't want to use a lot of dubbing on these because you don't need a horribly fat body. Mayflies have nymphs have fairly skinny bodies. And so I'm just going to tie or put enough dubbing on the thread to kind of cause its diameter to go somewhere between 2 and 3 times thread diameter. So you don't want a great big whacking bulk of dubbing. Spin it on there fairly tightly. This is pretty fine dubbing. It's a fairly fine material. So you're going to want to use something like an antron that will adhere to the thread nicely and spin up nice and tight. And then I'm going to start dubbing a somewhat tapered body at the back. So I'm going to start fairly skinny. And as I go forward, I'm going to gradually try to keep the body relatively even, but gradually getting a little thicker. Now, because this is a fine dubbing, and you don't want to put too much thread on because you want to control the body shape, it's going to take a while. You can't just wrap up one short little skein of dubbing and on your thread and make one pass to do the body. And so I'm going to do multiple layers here, and as you can see, it's gradually getting a little bit thicker as it gets further forward on the abdomen here. Now the thorax is going to be the same material, just a lot thicker. When I get to where the lead weight is finished, and you'd normally, the abdomen would start from the bend and go up towards the eye of the hook. What I'm going to do is I'm going to come slightly around the bend with dubbing and basically start a little bit of the abdomen will be dubbed on before I finish with the ribbing. So I'm going to make this a little thicker and bring it right around the bend of the hook. And then I'm going to bring my thread back to where the lead weight stopped, just before the bend. And at this point, I'm going to counter wrap the dubbing with my fine tinsel. So it's going the opposite direction. And that's why I tied it in with the tinsel on the far side of the hook. And that way the first wrap doesn't crush the tail down as you go around the first wrap. And I'm going to get 4 or 5 nice evenly spaced wraps up the body of the fly. When I get to the thread, I'm going to stop there. And again, this is slightly behind the bend that goes up to the eye. I'm going to tie that off and trim. Now this calls for some gills. And the first one I tied the gills on before I put the back on. And that didn't work so good. So what I'm going to do now is I'm going to get what is the back of the fly, the shell back, and I'm going to tie that on first before I tie the gills on. And to do that, I'm going to turn my hook upside down in the vise, and I'm going to change the angle so that I'm working with the thorax portion in here almost horizontal. Just makes it a little easier. And for the shell back, what I have is a goose quill feather. And this is one of the ones that I have pre-treated before with that spray adhesive to make the fibers stick together a little better. And I'm going to take about a 1/4 inch wide section of goose quill out of this thing. I'm just going to guesstimate where it is. And take it, slide it off. So now I have a slip of goose quill. And I'm going to tie this in by the thicker butt section. And to make that easier, I'm going to square it off a little bit like that. Take some of the really thick quill off. And I'm going to lay it down so that the shiny side of the quill is facing down. I'm going to lay that down right on the shank, extending forward a bit, and I'm going to cinch it down on top of what's that little banded part of the shank. I'm going to bind down the butts. Then I'm going to come in with my sections of ostrich herl, and I'm going to pull out 3 or 4 strands of that. And I'm going to bring my thread back to where I just tied in the wing section and trim off just a teeny bit of that, so I have a little about 1/8 of an inch sticking out. And I'm going to lay those down right where the thread is hanging again, tie them in, and wind back to where that quill section is tied in. Now I'm going to dub my thorax. And I already have a bit of bulk in there, so I can, with these mayflies and when we see the damselfly version later on, the thorax is quite a bit thicker than the abdomen of the fly. And the idea there is that this is where the adult wings are encased, so it's got a lot more bulk to it. And it's also where the gills are for the mayfly. This is the more complex version of the fly. So now I'm going to get in here and I'm going to dub over that with the thorax. And I'm going to stop maybe 2 to 3 eye widths behind the eye, because I need a place to tie in the quill, tie down, and I also need a place to tie in the legs. I'm going to make sure that's nice and fluffy bulky. And I'm going to leave my thread about halfway down the thorax at this point. I'm going to take these ostrich herl and I'm going to wrap them around the thorax underneath. There we go. Just 2 or 3 wraps of this stuff. And then I'm going to tie them off. That slipped. I need to try that again. 1. So these represent the gills on the fly. A little tricky to get them to sit. These are pretty fine fibers. And then tie them off. Trim the butts. Now I'm going to pull the quill back over and I'm going to put my thread right at the front again. Pull the quill back over and lay it flat down on top of all of this stuff. And it quill's separated a little bit. That's okay. There we go. I'm going to try and make sure that this is on top of the thorax, nice and smooth, and cinch it down right back to where the thorax ended. And I have to manipulate the quill a little bit to make it sit right. There we go. So that's the quill back on the top. I'm going to lift this up at the front and wrap back over a bit to cinch it down. And then I'm going to trim it clear. Now, the last thing I'm going to have here is the legs. And the legs I've got here is some mottled grouse. And I want them to be a little bit shorter than what the quill section is. So I'm just going to strip this back so that it's close to that. And I'm going to bare the stem. So that's going to be, that looks to be about thorax length. But what I'm going to do is once I tie it on by the stem, so 2 or 3 good wraps, and then I'm going to position it so it probably covers the part of that shell back. Pull it forward so it's the right length, and then I'm going to tie it off. So it's that having it slightly over long, and then lay it over top and tie it, pull it so that it's the right length. Saves you having to try and get a teeny little piece of pheasant, partridge or something similar and make it fit. And then whip finish. Now, as usual, that wrapped around a little bit, so I'm going to have to do a little manipulation here with my thumbnail to get that set of legs to sit right on top of the quill. There we go. And that's him. So this is the inverted portion or version of the fly. Now, to give you an idea, I've got some really fine wire here. And I'm going to make a little hook out of the fine wire and put it in through the eye of the hook. And get it to go. There we go. Take the hook out of the vise. Ah. If I could get this to sit properly. what I'm trying to show here is how the fly will sit on the hook when it's, so there when it's strung up, because of the weight, you'll see that that thing is going to float. Yeah, it's going to float point up. So there you go. That's the first version. And the first version is getting those legs in the proper spot is the tricky part. Okay, so that's the first one. Any questions so far?
No, that was good.
Okay, now the next version is basically similar, but it's the one that's going to float the other way around. It's not going to have lead on it. So let me get rid of some of this stuff, get the lead out of the way. Get the dubbing I'm using out of the way. And then this stuff I will need the partridge later. So now this one has an extra component, but it lacks the legs. So this is olive thread, olive 8 off. I'm going to start in the same place and wrap towards the back. And this is preparatory to putting the tails on, again, which is a short little tail for a mayfly. And the pattern calls for Lady Amherst tips, which is this stuff. And so I'm just going to pull a couple of those off. And I'm going to set them down so that the black markings are just at the bend, and then the tip of the black markings are out the back. I'm going to tie that on. There's about 4 strands there. Wrap forward so I don't have any weight on this. So hopefully this one is going to float hook down. So if you don't have Lady Amherst, you can use any fiber that's got that sort of marking. You could probably use golden pheasant crest for that too. The next thing is, as usual, the last thing you wrap forward is the first thing that goes on. So that's my tinsel. So once again, I'm taking my spool of tinsel and I'm going to wrap back over that till I get right down to where the barb used to be. Getting my tinsel out of the way. And now I need the back, and the back is it calls for wood duck, lemon wood duck. Well, I don't have lemon wood duck, but I've got some mallard flank. It's a nice color. That's what this is. So it's a little bit barred, and it's decent length fibers. And I'm going to take a section of this out that's a little more than 1/4 inch. And I'm going to tie it in by the butts, right there. Right back where the tinsel and everything's tied in. And this back is going to be pulled forward over top of the body. And I'm going to now dub in the body. And the body, it says, is light olive dubbing. And this is the lightest olive that I have that is fine enough to do this fly. And this is a super fine blue wing olive dubbing. And it's going to take a little, again, going to try and keep this fairly skinny body. So I'm going to stretch this out on the thread. And you can see that this superfine dubbing really wraps nicely on the thread. It gets down there and in size with a few strands, and it adheres nicely to the thread. I wish I had more of this particular type of superfine dubbing, because it's really easy to manage the thickness of the dubbing that you want on the thread with it. Just add little bits where you need them in order to make a fairly even rope of dubbing. And again, I'm going to go the very back, start where those fibers for the back are, and I'm going to keep it fairly skinny, wrapping forward, making it a little bit closer wraps as I get further forward to make it thicker. And I'll probably need a little more. And I'm going to take this right up to a little bit behind where that bend up to the eye starts. I'm going to use the same material for the thorax, but I don't have the gills this time. So I'm able to stop this a little further back before I tie in the shell back. There we go. And then I'm going to take the shell, this back, this barred mallard flank, and I'm going to lay that over top of the dubbing of the thorax and tie it down right in front like that. Snug it up. Turn them up. And I'm going to rib again, counter rivet. This is where Florin's little spool tamers would be perfect for this kind of material, because you're allowed to, it allows you to place these wraps, over wraps, nicely over top of the back, so that they're nice and even and they don't distort where the back is sitting on top. Turn them off. Two in front, two in back. Oh, and by the way, this is what the finished product is we're aiming at. And this is where I'm going to tie in the shell back, because the shell back is going to be on the top side of the hook here, as opposed to on this side of the hook, which was the last one. This is always a little trickier to get this one to sit properly. Once again, it's goose quill. And this one I don't think has been treated properly, so it's likely to split on me like the other one did. And I'm going to take a little less than a 1/4 inch section. I'm going to square up the ends. Tie them right in front of that where I stopped the thorax. All right, we're going to start the thorax where I stopped the abdomen. Now, no gills this time. So I'm going to place this, try to place this so it sits right on top of the shank with the point down and the bend facing up. Get it in position. And I'm going to use the same material for this guy for the thorax as I did for the abdomen. Now, in some mayfly patterns, they do it with a darker, the thorax with a darker material. And I think that would work better for the the next one I'm going to do if I had a darker olive and a lighter back. So anyway, so I'm going to make a fairly chunky thorax again. Now what happened?
At this point, if you want contrast, the easy way is to reach for the peacock curl.
Darn. That twisted around. That back twisted around on me. I don't want it on the bottom side. I want it on the inside of the bend. There we go. It spun around the shank on me. All right, that's more like it. Yeah, now that's a thought, is to do it with peacock curl. All right. So now I'm going to stop 2 eye widths back of the eye with the thorax, so I don't go any further forward than that. And maybe just a hair more. So I want that thorax to be at least double the diameter of the abdomen. And it's a little tapered. You see, it's a little narrower at the front than it is at the back. And that's to help this shell back to sit down properly when I tie it on. So I'm going to pull it forward and put my thumb on it to hold it in place. And then I'm going to tie it down 2 wraps so that it can be adjusted. And then I'm going to pull it back and wrap in front, good and solid. And get in here and now the legs are going to be on the bottom side, so I have to turn him over. And I'm going to do the same thing as I did with the legs, but they're going to be, instead of that grouse this time, they're going to be a partridge. And I've prepped these a little bit. You can see, and this one is a dyed green partridge, olive partridge. And I'm just going to make it a little bit skinnier, a little shorter. And again, that's about the right length. I measure it about the shell back length or the thorax length. And then I'm going to just make a slight adjustment in how the hook is in the vise so that it's kind of, this is a little more horizontal. I'm going to lay that down again, extending past where the thorax ends. I'm going to do a couple of very light wraps, and then I'm going to adjust it so it's sitting in the right spot, and I'm going to pull it forward, gently pull it forward so it's the right length, which means that the fibers are about thorax length. And that places the fibers the right side and the right length on the hook. And then I come in here and I trim the tag end of that off and make a head. Just in front. And then we'll whip finish that. And as Florin always does with his, we'll double the whip finish just to make it so I don't have to get in there with head cement and gum all the fibers up in order to keep the whip finish from coming undone. And that's him. Now that one has as you can see, it has now a whitish tail. It has a dark green body and thorax with a slightly lighter back, and the shell backs here and the legs underneath. So it's going to fish without the weight it's going to fish with this part of the hook point down. So that's that guy. Any questions on him?
Do you find that it's less prone to snag up on this version compared to regular flies, just because of the way the hook is positioned?
My guess is I haven't fished these mayfly versions much.
Okay.
But I've fished the damselfly version, and the damselfly version is this one, which is point down, and I don't find it snags up, even though I'm typically fishing those damselflies down along the weed bed.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that's because the shape of the fly makes it go like this, and it doesn't tend to sink down into the weeds as much.
Mm-hmm.
Which is what
Okay.
you want. You want your
Yep.
damselflies not to be in the weeds. You want to be them on top of the weeds.
Yeah.
Damsels and dragons, the way I've fished those, I have a 17.5-foot clipper canoe. And I would get my trolling motor. That was my wife, the trolling motor, that she wouldn't want to paddle. So I'd use her as counterbalance, because if I didn't have counterbalance in front of the canoe,
Yeah.
go where
Exactly.
it. So I would tell her, don't bother trolling. And I would sit in the back with the rod across the thwart and held in place with my foot. And I would do a very slow zigzag paddle. And I'd use a type 3 sink line with a short leader, like about a 6-foot leader.
Okay.
And that allows the type 3 goes down and sits on top of the weeds. And then with the short leader, the fly sits just up above them. And then I just zigzag back and forth.
Nice.
A very effective way, both with these patterns and with the Doc Spratley's and the floating style dragonfly as well, which the one that I think I showed you before, which has toothpicks in it to give it a little buoyancy.
Mm-hmm.
I'm just putting
I have
away.
a general question for
Yep.
for kind of all of you. How well do you think this would work on bending a hook? Because if you take a standard nymph hook that's longer shank, like a 96-72, and you bend the front, what's your experience with bending hooks, or you don't do much of that?
I've actually bent hooks, and I've got a pile that I had bent for tying nymphs, and they are great. You just have to be slow and cautious. Mine are a little sharper bend than these ones that Dave's using, but if you use like a round wooden rod or a steel rod or something that's round, you can get the rounded bend more easily than if you use pliers. But I haven't found a problem with the integrity of the hook once it's bent, as long as you do it slowly and carefully. And the other thing that you could do is actually heat it a little bit before you bend it, so that it's easier to bend without potentially breaking the hook.
Yeah,
Okay, thank you.
As Florence and I were talking before we started tying, there's also this hook, which is typically sold for doing San Juan worms. And I think that would work as well. That's another mustad hook. I think what it's called a worm hook. So you could probably tie a nymph on that style hook. These worm hooks tend to be a little heavier shank, though. They're a little heftier material. Anyway, options. I guess there's always options for what you're going to use. So this is the same hook again in the vise, and this is the damselfly version. And this one I would tie on a size 10 rather than a 14 or a 16. The mayfly ones for here, I think the size 10 is a little big. So I would tie, this is the damselfly version on a size 10, but I think if I was going to tie a production line of mayflies on this style of hook, I would tie them on a 14 or a 16 for here. In Japan, I guess that maybe the nymphs are bigger. So this one is got similar approach. The material is the tail is rabbit fur from a rabbit strip. The legs is, again, this is a dyed grouse. The shellback is not quilled. It's stretch floss or stretch back. But the body is the same olive dubbing. It's this guy here, same blue-winged olive dubbing. The rib is going to be fine copper wire. So the first thing we're going to put on is the tail. Now, as Florida and I were talking earlier, the tails on damsels are spread vertically and they're quite fan-shaped. Now, you said it's the gills, is that right, Florence?
Yeah, those are like those paddle-like gills. Mm-hmm. And if you actually look at a lot of these nymphs, you know, the mayflies, a lot of them have these plate-like gills along the abdomen. And the damsels, that's what they have in their tails. They're sort of short and it's kind of leaf shaped.
So this is the wool, the rabbit fur strip, and I'm taking a little batch of it right off next to this rabbit skin. And you can see it's a lot fuzzier than those mayfly ones, and it's going to tie on probably, again, gap width behind. And all I'm going to do with that is cinch it down. I'm going to use the tag ends of to flesh out the body on the damsel. So it's going to make it a little thicker. So I won't need as much dubbing. I'm going to take my thread right back to the bend again. And so you can see this rabbit fur spreads out. It makes for a nice fan shape at the back, like all these. The dragonflies are the same, are somewhat the same, but they don't have they have a pointy back, whereas these damsels have this sort of fan shaped tail to them. And I really saw that one year when we were fishing Swan Lake, which is south of Windermere, off to the side. And I was watching the damsels that were at the dock by the campground. I was watching them swim out from underneath the dock, and you could see this tail that was going like this, and it was quite prominent. And while I was standing there watching these nymphs do that, this monster trout came out from underneath the dock and picked him off. It's quite interesting. Okay, so now we have a little piece of wire. Just gonna trim it off here. And I'm going to put that on there. Again, I'm going to start about where the hook is bent. I'm going to tie it on, and I'm going to wrap down so that it's on the far side of the hook. Once again, we're going to counter wrap the body. So starting on the far side of the hook makes that first wrap not crush the tail. And then I'm going to get my superfine dubbing and pull out little bits of it. You can probably see I just pull it out of the package in strands, and this stuff is quite, I don't know what you call it. It comes out quite in a fine strand. You can see it pulls out little bits. That allows you to lay those fine strands along the thread and just lay them on there and twist them on. And if you see there's a spot where it's a little thin, you just pull a short little piece out and stick it on there. And then where it's too thick, you can sometimes just stretch it out by pulling up and down on the thread. I'm going to slide that up. And we're going to go around here. And I'm going to keep this fairly even because damselfly bodies don't have a lot of taper to them. They tend to be fairly straight until you get to where the thorax is. And then they have a bulky thorax. And as I say, usually a darker color. And I don't have my peacock curl here, but that sounds like a good idea for this pattern would be to use peacock curl for the thorax. I think that would give it the nice color differential and the bulk that the peacock curl would provide, and maybe catch a little air in there too, which would be good. And do that right up to the bend. And take my wire and counter wrap the wire. That gives whatever segmentation that the abdomen of these guys have. And it also binds down the body material. My wire scissors out. So far, so good. And once again, the back is going to come from on the upward part of the hook, and the gills are going to be on the bottom. So I'm going to take the scud back. It's 1/8 inch scud back in an olive color. I'm going to tie that right in right there. Need to take the twist out of my thread. Get on it. God, Lord. This thread, like I say, when it hangs for a minute or two, it tends to spin itself the wrong way. Yeah, there we go. So now I got that scud back tied in right at the bend. And this is where I'm going to put the thicker body in, the thicker body material, or Lauren suggested maybe peacock curl would be good. So I can put this on a little thicker. Doesn't have to be quite so fine a dubbing on the thread. Can be a little more bulky. Because I want this thorax to be at least double, maybe a little more than double the diameter of the abdomen. Get back here right to where that back is tied in. Again, stop shy about 2 eye widths behind the eye. I think it's okay if this thorax is a little fuzzy, so you don't have to really pinch down the dubbing and make it skinny. You can leave the thorax to be a little fuzzier, as long as it's got some bulk. Then I'm going to take my shell back forward over top, hold it down. want to position it so that it's right on top of the thorax in the underside of that bend. Tie off in front. And when I tie this stuff off, I cut it off, I'm going to pull it up, stretch it a little bit, and get in with my scissors, snip it, and then the cut end kind of almost disappears into the thread. And I'm going to turn it over, and then I'm going to again adjust the hook in the vise so that this portion of the hook is pointing straight sideways. And then I'm going to get my little bit of grouse here. Again, it's an olive grouse, olive dyed grouse. And I'm going to get a small one. And I'm going to measure him again, the thorax length. Maybe a little bit big, yeah. Now strip these fibers out of the way. So there's bare stem there. I'm going to lay it down on top of the thorax. And again, 1, 2 light wraps. Make sure the stem is on top. And then I'm going to pull the stem forward. And I can leave these legs a little longer. The damselfly legs stick out a bit more than the mayfly ones do. So I'm going to leave it about thorax length. And I got wrap in front. And come in and trim him off. And whip finish. So basically the same pattern with minor variations in materials. You can tie them so for the mayfly ones, you can tie them with that little piece of lead so that they float point up, and you don't need the lead if they're going to point down. And there's the damselfly version. And big difference with the damselfly version is these legs are longer and this tail is broader. And that's it.
Very nice. I have a question for you, Dave. You know, I've noticed you use the tip of the feather for your legs.
Mm-hmm.
It makes it look very, very nice.
Yep.
I'm wondering, when I tie, when I use various hackle fibers for tails, including soft hackle, sometimes I find that the tips are a little stiffer than if I just use just a clump of fibers. Do you notice any difference in that, or?
Well, I normally when I do legs on a nymph, even if it has a shell back, I would do the typical pheasant. If I'm using partridge, for instance, I would use the typical English way of putting a partridge hackle on, and then just force the legs down, right?
Right.
Or I would strip half of them off of the partridge so that it went around, so it's fairly sparse. But for these patterns, I like the more prominent legs, and I like the coloration on them. So I may do some of that on other patterns as well. I just like, I don't know if you can see, let me turn it so you can see. I like the way that pattern has kind of markings on it, right?
Right, yeah.
And
oh, actually, you know, I have a suggestion. If you're gonna try this on other patterns, what you could try to do is take, because you're using a whole feather from the bird, just snip the tip of the feather and do exactly what you're doing, but then you end up with just fibers from further down the feather.
Yeah,
That might work too.
yeah. Well, this stuff is reasonably stiff, tied like that, because it's got the stem in it, right?
Yeah, that's why I'm trying to think about the stiffness of the stem, which I
But
usually,
it's not bad. It's not bad. It's not that, because you're using the very tip. It's
Yeah.
not that. And the tip of the feather actually ends sort of halfway, right?
yeah.
So, and I've used grouse, and I've used these guys here. These are grouse as well. And there's the partridge. So any one of those feathers, I think, works quite well tied that way. So I'm going to try that technique on some others as well. I think it'll be useful. Now, with this curved hook, it definitely makes those fibers stick straight down, which might not happen if you were doing it on a straight shanked hook. So it might take a bit of experimenting.
Well, as long as you tie it in front of a bump of, if you have a bump of dubbing and you tie it in front of the dubbing,
Mhm.
The way you do it, you just pull it right back tight against the dubbing. It's going to lift those fibers up.
Yeah, it is. So that's it, gents. I'm going to stop the recording.